Hey, it's Demetrius. Welcome back to the channel. And in today's video, we're going to talk about a seemingly very scary word within the life insurance or high cash value whole life insurance community, because so many people talk about how you never, ever, ever want your policy to become a MEC or a modified endowment contract. And my hope is that after watching all the way through this video, you'll have a much clearer understanding of what a modified endowment contract is, and hopefully it's no longer a super scary word by any stretch of the imagination. So without further ado, let's hop into it. And the first question we need to answer is, what exactly is a modified endowment contract? And this is important because it comes up often in conversation that I have with clients. It comes up on a very regular basis when we're discussing overfunded whole life insurance. And so if you're looking into using life insurance as a wealth building tool for savings, or you want to just incorporate it into your overall growth strategy, understanding the impact of a policy that's classified as a MEC is going to be key for you. So let's start off with a little bit of a history lesson, okay? So leading up to the 1980s, there were a lot of high-income individuals that were using life insurance as a legal tax shelter. They would pour a large sums of cash into these policies with very little death benefit. Not because they needed or wanted life insurance, but because it gave them a way to grow wealth tax deferred and access it tax free. And then eventually what happened was Congress caught on, they stepped in and said, okay, this is too much. We got to put some limits and we got to put some caps on this. And so in 1988, they passed the TAMRA Act, which introduced a new rule to prevent life insurance from being used as an investment-like, quote unquote, investment-like vehicle with little to no death benefit. And just remember, life insurance in and of itself is not an investment. So anyways, that rule gave us this term of a modified endowment contract. And just for the sake of clarity, again, life insurance is not an investment, but it's an incredible place to save, grow, and use your money, especially safe assets. And so when you hear MEC, what you want to be thinking about is too much money too fast. But let me just kind of expound on that a little bit. This is not like a 401k or a Roth IRA where there's a fixed contribution limit for everybody. Instead, the IRS, what they do is they limit how much premium you can put into a policy in relation to the policy's death benefit, especially in the early years, okay? They run what's called a 7-pay test, which checks to see if you funded the policy too aggressively in the first 7 years in relation to that policy's death benefit. And so there's a little bit more to it than that in terms of the 7-pay test, because it's not merely just a first 7 years, but you kind of get the gist of how they run their tests. And so if you go over the allowable limit, the policy becomes a modified endowment contract. And that changes how the IRS ultimately sees your policy and taxes it from that point on. And here's why this matters, okay? With a non-MEC policy, you're going to get tax-deferred growth, tax-free access through loans, and no early withdrawal penalties as well. But when your policy becomes a MEC, gains are going to be taxed first. So LIFO instead of FIFO, okay? So last in, first out instead of first in, first out. Withdrawals before the age of 59 and a half, they may end up being hit with a 10% withdrawal penalty as well. And even policy loans themselves can be taxed as well. So even though it's still life insurance, for tax purposes, it ends up behaving more like a retirement account once your policy becomes a modified endowment contract. Now, the 7-pay test is how the IRS determines whether a policy becomes a MEC, okay? And so it sets a limit on how much premium can be paid over a 7-year period based on the policy's death benefit at that point in time. And so keep in mind that the 7-pay test is not about the first 7 years per se and only the first 7 years. It's more or less a rolling 7 years. And then they're still looking at the relationship between the policy's death benefit in relation to how much premium has gone into that policy. And so if you go over that limit at any given point, the policy is then classified as a MEC. And it can stay that way forever, but you'll have a pretty decent window of time to be able to reverse that. In other words, if you put in too much premium, the life insurance company will notify you and say, hey, your policy is now a MEC, or they'll say, hey, did you want your policy to become a MEC? It didn't start off that way. And so either way, you're going to have some time to either reverse it and just kind of get some of your premiums returned back to you to a point where your policy is no longer a MEC. And so just know that it's normally a 6-week window at the very smallest, although it could be a longer window as well, because it's going to be based on your next policy anniversary date. We'll talk about that in greater detail if you want to in the comments. Happy to help. But anyways, this is why proper structure of a policy design matters so much is because you don't want your policy to MEC, especially if it wasn't classified as one from the very beginning and you didn't want that to happen from the very beginning. This is what we mean when we talk about the fact that these life insurance policies are specially designed life insurance contracts. We're not just throwing money into a policy at random. We're engineering it in a very specific way that gets us really close to the MEC limit without crossing the MEC limit. And we do this again because it retains your tax advantage status of your policy, which is 9 times out of 10 what people want every time. And so are MECs a bad thing? That's a question that we have to answer as well. If we're trying to stay away from MECs because it gives us all these tax advantages, are MECs inherently a bad thing? And the answer is absolutely not, or at least not necessarily, especially for the right person. It depends on what you're looking to accomplish. So if you're a nonprofit, if you're a foundation, other sort of tax exempt entity, it's not necessarily a bad thing because these organizations are often already exempt from income tax. So the usual MEC penalties and taxable loan, they don't really apply to these sorts of entities, which means they can use a MEC structure to store capital very efficiently, grow assets within inside the policy, while also potentially leaving a very large legacy down the line. So for those entities, a MEC might actually make perfect sense, right? I'm not saying that it's going to make sense if you have one of those entities, or if you're a part of one. There's a whole lot more that kind of goes into it. But for a lot of those entities, it can make potential perfect sense for them, whether the goal is to maximize cash value or the goal is just death benefit, or potentially even both. And so the key is just knowing what your goals are and designing a policy accordingly. So the bottom line is this: a MEC happens when you put too much money, too much premium into a policy too quickly relative to the death benefit, which ultimately changes how the IRS treats the policy for tax purposes. And so for most people, avoiding a MEC is crucial if you want to maintain tax-free access to your cash value within the policy. But for certain entities, MECs can be a very powerful tool, and it can be a very intentional strategy if it makes sense. And so either way, structure is everything. And that's why I build policies that push the MEC limit but never cross it unless there's a good reason to. So if you want to learn more about how these policies are designed or whether they could be a good fit for your financial goals, go ahead and check out the link in the description or the pinned comment to book a call with me directly. I'll be more than happy to guide you through what an optimized policy could look like for you specifically. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.